So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case, another serial killer case, and potentially my biggest case ever on this channel. I have slaved over this research for about 3 weeks now. I put my absolute heart and soul into it. I mean, I put my heart and soul into every case I ever cover, but this one, I have done nothing but read about this guy. And this is such a big case that it is going to be a 3-parter. This is part 1. Part 3 is where most of the case actually takes place, like the murders and the cover-ups and everything like that. So yeah, make sure you subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss when part 2 and part 3 come out. Part 2 will be out in a day or two. I promise you. And then part 3 will follow quickly after. So today we're going to be talking about the beauty queen killer, also known as the snapshot killer, also known for some other things. They're so mysterious. It'll all become clear as we go through the videos. Now, before we get into part 1, I just want to thank our sponsor for making this video possible, Function of Beauty. You guys already know by now that I have been using and loving and swearing by Function of Beauty for over 2 years at this point. They are the only company I really truly trust with my hair care. And the reason I love them so much is because they formulate each of their products custom to each person. Because everyone's hair is so unique to them. It's kind of like a fingerprint. I've always found it so crazy that we're expected to all just go to the store and buy the same shampoos and conditioners on the shelf. Because really, they're not unique to your hair. They're not going to be targeting what your hair specifically needs. And that's why I love my custom formulas from Function of Beauty. All you have to do is go on their website, fill out a quick 2-minute quiz all about your hair and what you want to improve on as well. So I always choose things like hydrate and strengthen, volumize, deep condition. You even get to customize other aspects of the products too, like the colors, the scent, the strength of the scent. You even get to put your name on the bottle, which by the way is perfect if you've got roommates or if you're a student and you're in a house share or something like that, because your products have your name on it, so no one else is allowed to use them. Honestly, my hair has never been so strong and soft at the same time. Those are 2 of the most important things that I want for my hair, and Function of Beauty gives me that. But that's not even the main thing I love about them. What I love about this company is their ethos and their values. They are 100% vegan and cruelty-free. All their ingredients are extensively tested by human volunteers, so there's no animal testing at all. Their products also have no parabens, no sulfates, no GMOs. And I have some good news because Function of Beauty are very kindly offering you guys 20% off of your first set when you go through the link down below in the description of this video. Honestly, do it. It was the best thing I ever did for my hair, so it might be the best thing you ever do for yours. Thanks again to Function of Beauty for sponsoring this video. Now, before we get into it, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I am about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. Well, 3 videos. I just want to give a couple of content warnings before we get into this one. Because this is such a long case, there is a lot that goes into it, and at times it can be very intense. It's just like stuff keeps happening one after another, so if you're kind of in a fragile state of mind at the moment, maybe this isn't the best case for you to watch. Some of the more specific themes include rape, sexual assault, torture. A lot of the victims in this case are young girls as well, teenagers a lot of the time, so if any of that is something that you don't think you can deal with right now, please click out of the video and look after yourself. That is the most important thing. I'm sure I'll see you again at some point with a different case that's maybe a little bit more suitable for you, but until then, bye-bye. With all that being said, let's just get into the case. So this one starts out in Miami, Florida, in the United States in the 1980s. And that is where 20-year-old model Rosario Gonzalez lived and worked at the Miami Grand Prix as a promo girl. It was late February 1984, and Miami Grand Prix weekend, Rosario had worked the whole thing. She was really tired at this point. She'd seen all the men come and go in their flashy cars. They would always show off. They would always flirt with all the models and the promo girls. She was used to it at this point. Rosario didn't really care for any of the men. She was actually engaged at the time. She had a fiance at home. So what she would do is, like, the men would come over and try and flirt with her, and she'd just put her hand up with her little engagement ring on. She'd be like, not interested. I mean, to a degree, she would kind of humour these men because they were clients. She was trying to get them to buy stuff after all. But she knew how to handle them. When they got a little bit too much, she'd be like, look, I'm not interested. But on February 26th, 1984, one of these race car drivers caught her off guard. On this particular day, it was about to be Rosario's lunch break, and so her and all of her model promo girlfriends all walked out to the car park. They all stood there in a group for a while, they were all talking, she waved and then walked to her car. I think she was just gonna go out somewhere, go buy some lunch, and then she'd be back after her lunch break to work the rest of the day. So she sets off walking to her car alone, and as she did, she was approached by one of these race car drivers. This wasn't an unusual thing to happen. A lot of the time, the race car drivers would stay back and talk to the girls because that's one of the main reasons they got into racing. And so Rosario just did her usual flash of the hand. She was like, I'm not interested, I'm engaged. And this guy was like, no, I'm not trying to hit on you, I just want to talk to you. The two of them were seen chatting for a while in the car park, and Rosario didn't seem distressed or weirded out or anything. It seemed like the two of them were having like a very genuine, interesting conversation. But that would actually be the last time anyone ever saw 20-year-old Rosario Gonzalez, because after that conversation in the car park, she disappeared without a trace. Police did absolutely everything they could to find this girl. They questioned everyone at the Grand Prix, all of her co-workers, all her promo girlfriends, and it turned out that one of her co-workers had actually overheard the conversation that Rosario was having with this guy. He said that the first thing this guy said to Rosario was that she was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen in his entire life. And so Rosario did the whole, no, not interested. But the man said, oh no, don't worry, I'm not trying to hit on you. I'm actually just a photographer, a fashion photographer. I work with models all the time, and I think you'd be perfect for this photo shoot that I'm planning. I think he even had the camera in his hand at the time, so he was like showing Rosario, telling her all about his job. He told Rosario that she just had this look about her, that he could see her on the front page of these massive fashion magazines. She could be rich and famous. All she needed to do was just do a photo shoot. This co-worker that overheard this conversation couldn't really hear anything else past this point, but they did see that Rosario was responding positively to the conversation. She was smiling. She didn't seem stressed out. But the co-worker then watched as Rosario Gonzalez and this race car driver got into the same car and drove out of the car park. And Rosario never returned for her lunch break that day. That was it. That was the last time anyone ever saw her. So immediately, this was huge for the investigation. This told police that this man must be responsible for Rosario's disappearance because he was the last person she was with. It seemed as though something bad had definitely happened to Rosario. But before police could even get any further in this investigation, another woman disappeared just a week after Rosario, again in the Miami area. This time it was 23-year-old Elizabeth Kenyon, better known as Beth to her friends and family. Beth worked as a teacher at one of the local schools. I think she was more a teaching assistant. She worked specifically with kids that had special needs. She helped them through their studies. She also helped to run the cheerleading team as well. And Beth was just stunning. She was so physically beautiful. Her face, just like Rosario Gonzalez actually. They were both beautiful, beautiful women, and they both found a way to make money through their physical appearance. Rosario Gonzalez was a promo girl, a model, and Beth Kenyon actually entered a few beauty pageants in her time. She even got all the way to the Miss Florida finals, and although she didn't win, she still had quite a promising career in that industry if she wanted it. But in early March of 1984, Beth Kenyon suddenly stopped answering her phone. She stopped returning people's calls, she didn't turn up to work, and everyone was super worried about her. So her parents went and reported her disappearance to the police, and police were terrible in this case. They just shrugged it off, saying, oh, she's just a young girl, you know? She's probably just run away. Young girls do it all the time. She'll come back in her own time when she's stopped being dramatic. Police didn't believe that she was in any danger. They thought she was a voluntary runaway, like she had left rather than been taken. I mean, they still looked for her a little bit, but not with anywhere near as much urgency as her family wanted. I mean, this is their daughter that could be in danger right now. She's not answering her phone. She's nowhere to be found. and police are just messing about. Beth Kenyon's family were worried sick, and they were not happy leaving this case in the hands of these police that really didn't seem to have Beth's best interests at heart. And so they went out and found their own private investigators. These private investigators were a man called Ken Whitaker and another man called Ken Whitaker. It was a father and son. It was Ken Jr., Ken Sr. They worked together as a private investigator little duo. I just found it quite funny that they had the same name and they worked together. But anyway, they got to work on Beth's disappearance case, and the first thing they did was they went to her apartment to have a look around, see if there were any clues as to her whereabouts. There really wasn't much at all. I mean, it's not like she left a note. All the investigators really found in Beth's apartment was this like small photo album, which they thought could be quite a help in the investigation. It pretty much showed them everyone in Beth's life. I mean, all her friends, ex-boyfriends were in here, family members, different people from different parts of her life. So if someone had done something to Beth, and it was someone she knew, then they were probably in this photo album. So the next thing the investigators did was they went round every single shop or food place or anything like that near Beth's work at the school, because she would often go out for lunch and she would go shopping in the area. So they thought maybe the people in these shops and restaurants would recognise pictures of her. They might know what happened to her on the day she went missing. They were taking this photo album round with them to every single one of these shops saying, do you recognise any of these people in here? And that was when they found something. A man that worked at the local gas station told these private investigators that on the day that Beth Kenyon disappeared, she'd actually been in the gas station. She came in, filled her car, and then she was approached by a man. This gas station attendant overheard a very brief part of her conversation with this man. It seemed that she already knew this man. It wasn't a stranger approaching her. And they seemed to be talking about a photo shoot. Something about a photo shoot and something about her being a model. The gas station attendant kind of described it as two old friends meeting up. That was the kind of vibe that they got from this situation. And as the attendant was telling this story to the private investigators, they were flicking through this photo album when suddenly they froze and they pointed to one of these pictures. They pointed to a man and they said, that's him. That's the guy that she was speaking to. That was the guy that was in the gas station. Now, this photo album, it didn't have any kind of notes or labels, or it didn't say anyone's names or anything. And so the private investigators grabbed this photo album and they took it back to Beth's parents and they said, who's this guy? Because we have reason to believe that Beth was with him on the day that she disappeared. And Beth's parents looked at this photo and they said, oh, that's Christopher Wilder. That's one of Beth's ex-boyfriends. Actually, he was never officially her boyfriend, but they'd been seeing each other for a good few months. They broke things off quite a while before Beth disappeared, so it wasn't a very recent thing. It wasn't like they broke up and then this happened, because that would be very, very suspicious. Just a quick little background on Christopher Wilder. He was 39 years old at this point in the case. He was actually originally from Australia, but he moved to America, started up a contracting company, became super, super rich. I don't exactly know how he met Beth, but they were only talking for a couple of months when Beth decided to break things off with Christopher. And things didn't end on bad terms either, so her parents weren't too worried to hear that she'd bumped into Christopher on the day that she went missing, because it seemed it was quite an amicable split. It was Beth that broke up with him because Christopher Wilder was quite in love with Beth Kenyon and he just wanted things to go too fast. He was talking about marriage. He asked her to marry him. Not like an official proposal, I don't think, but he was asking her if she was going to marry him one day and she was like, oh my god, this is too much for me. She was in her early 20s. This guy was nearly 40 and she didn't love the age gap and all these different things. She thought he was a good guy, but he just wasn't for her, and so she broke it off. But other than that, other than the fact that he wanted to go a bit too fast in this relationship, Beth's parents didn't think he was a weird guy by any means. It wasn't like he was resentful and revenge seeking and he was going to go and find her and do something to her because she broke up with him. In fact, her parents said that he was quite a nice guy. It was just a shame that they didn't really get along in that way, that they didn't want the same things, because he was quite nice. So the private investigators got in contact with Christopher Wilder. They called him on the phone because Beth's family still actually had his number. By now it was about 6 days after Beth Kenyon had gone missing, and he said he actually hadn't seen her since they they bumped into each other at the gas station that day. They both left separately and he hasn't seen her since. He actually told the investigators on the phone that he was quite busy at that point. I mean, he owned his own business, his own contracting company, he was a very busy man, and so he said, if you want to talk about this a bit more, just come down to my house. I'd be happy to sit and chat and tell you all about mine and Beth's relationship. And so they did. These private investigators turned up at Christopher Wilder's house maybe a day or two after this phone call, and when they knocked on the door, he wasn't home. So they decided to have a bit of a look around outside his house while they were there, at least get something out of the trip there. So they were looking in his windows, they didn't really see much, and then they went round to the back of his house and they started rummaging through his trash. And as they were rummaging through all these bin bags, all this stuff that he was going to throw out, one of them found a crumpled up photograph. He pulled it out and tried to smooth all the creases out, and this was a photograph of Christopher Wilder standing in front of his Porsche. He owned a Porsche. But there was actually a lot more to this photograph than what initially meets the eye, because this photograph of Wilder standing in front of his Porsche was actually taken at the Miami Grand Prix over the weekend, where he had raced his Porsche. And the Miami Grand Prix was where Rosario Gonzalez had gone missing a week before Elizabeth Kenyon. So now police have links to Wilder from both of these missing women. Neither of these women knew each other. Rosario and Elizabeth had no idea who each other were, but somehow they're both linked back to Christopher Wilder. So now police are quite suspicious of this guy. I say quite. He was prime suspect number one in both of these girls' disappearances, but they had no idea where he was, and they couldn't get hold of him. They tried calling and calling and calling, and he was not answering his phone. He didn't turn back up at his home address for, well, ever. Every time they tried to check and go and knock on his front door, he was not home. He didn't come back. Upon hearing this information, Beth Kenyon's parents were terrified. They were shocked. They were so scared for their daughter, and so they wasted no time and they went straight to the FBI to get them involved in this case. In the meantime, the private investigators actually thought it would be a good idea to leak their findings to the press about Christopher Wilder and his links to these two missing girls. They thought that if they hinted about their speculation of Christopher Wilder in the newspaper and he found out, if he read these newspaper articles, then it might set a fire under him. It'd put pressure on him and he would mess up. He would show up somewhere. And so they did. The newspapers printed this story about Christopher Wilder, although they didn't actually use Wilder's name once. They didn't name this person that they were looking for. They just hinted about who it was. So the article would say they were looking for an Australian race car driver in connection with the disappearances of these two girls. This Australian race car driver is believed to own a company and be very wealthy. He's believed to have competed in the Miami Grand Prix. Like, all these different traits were adding up and it was becoming a very specific profile of a person, but they never actually used his name. It was obviously about Christopher Wilder though. How many other people are like that in Miami? An Australian wealthy contractor with a race car that competed in the Miami Grand Prix. How many of those is there about? Probably not that many. So now that the FBI were involved in the case, they could do a lot more than what they could before. Obviously, private investigators, there's certain things that they can't do because they're private. Whereas now the FBI were involved, they decided to just go and straight up raid Christopher Wilder's home, break in and search the whole thing. Because still, he's nowhere to be found. It seemed that he'd fled his own home and he was probably on the run somewhere if he was responsible for these disappearances. So the whole team moved in, they knocked down the front door, they all ran in, they're looking in every single different room, they're looking for Wilder, they're looking for either of the girls, any kind of evidence or clues as to where they are. But there was absolutely nothing. In this whole house, there was nothing. But actually, that in itself was something to the police, because it seemed that Wilder's house had been meticulously cleaned. Everything was bleached, everything was in its place. There was absolutely nothing that looked even lived in. It seemed that Christopher Wilder was a whole 3 steps ahead of the investigation and they were going to have to try harder if they wanted to track him down. But what the FBI could conclude from this search was that Christopher Wilder, wherever he was at this point in time, he'd taken most of his everyday belongings, like couple of changes of clothes, he'd taken his briefcase, he'd taken his toothbrush. It was very clear to the FBI that this man was now on the run, and it was going to be very hard for them to track him down. So let's talk about Christopher Wilder a little bit more, shall we? Who is this mysterious man that police are now trying to find? Christopher Bernard Wilder was born on March 13th, 1945 in Sydney, Australia. But in fact, Christopher Wilder was almost never even born at all, because as his mother was giving birth to him, he actually stopped breathing. And the doctors thought they were going to lose him. It was so bad, in fact, that hospital staff actually rushed a priest into the room to pray for this baby as he was about to die. But as soon as the priest started this prayer, Christopher Wilder took his first breath. He was alive. He spent a few days in the hospital, but other than that, he was good to go. He survived. However, that wouldn't be the only near-death experience that Wilder would have as a child. When he was just 2 years old, he almost died again when he jumped into, I think it was the ocean or a swimming pool or something, and he couldn't swim. He was 2 years old, and he almost drowned. He was eventually saved just in the nick of time. He'd already stopped breathing by the time they got him out of the water and back onto land. They very nearly lost him again, but after performing some CPR on him, they brought him back, and he was never fully the same again after this incident. When he stopped breathing for so long, something must have happened in his brain. Something must have shut off or stopped working in his brain, because after this point, for the rest of his childhood, Christopher Wilder would get seizures and random fainting spells. It seemed that whatever had happened that day had seriously affected some part of his brain. And over time, it did gradually get better. He stopped fainting as much. He had seizures less and less as he got into adulthood. But was it ever really better? But that's skipping ahead slightly. Let's go back to when he was just born, when he was like 2 years old. Christopher Wilder, I believe, was an only child. His father was an American naval officer who met his mother, who was an Australian woman, when he was stationed over in Australia for the Second World War. The two of them met, they fell in love, and then they had Christopher. Because of his father's job, the family found themselves having to travel a lot when Christopher was just a child, because his dad was only over in Australia for World War II. So this case actually takes place at the same time, well, Christopher Wilder was born at the same time as the Brownout murders that I covered maybe last month. If you remember, a lot of American soldiers were sent over to Australia to help out because they were allies, and one of those American soldiers was Wilder's father. He went over to Australia at the same time as Eddie Leonsky did. But anyway, again, I'm going off on a tangent. I was trying to say that Christopher Wilder and his family travelled around a lot through his childhood for his father's job. They would go to the Philippines, America, Australia, all different places, wherever he was required. And so for that reason, Wilder had quite an uncertain, unstable childhood. He never had a friend group. He never had, a firm setting. He never felt like he belonged anywhere because he never got chance to settle in. By the time he settled in, they'd have to go again. They travelled around like that all the way through Christopher Wilder's childhood, and it wasn't until he was about 15 that they finally settled in America for good. But again, that's me skipping ahead. He's not 15 yet. Growing up, when he was still very young, Christopher Wilder felt immense pressure to live up to his father's expectations, or to be more like his father, because his father was this big, brave, courageous war hero. But Christopher just felt that he was none of those things. He was quite a shy boy, and his seizures and fainting spells prevented him from doing a lot of things that the other kids could do. He always just felt that he wasn't enough for his parents. Although that wasn't due to any pressure from them, his parents were actually really good with him from what I could find in my research. They never expected too much of him. They understood his limitations with his seizures and his fainting. They never put pressure on him. All that pressure inside of him was from himself. They would encourage him in a healthy way to go out and do new things and step outside of his comfort zone, but they never told him that he had to do this or he had to be like his father. But this pressure that he would put on himself, it caused him so much frustration and anger inside that he would give himself these expectations and he would never meet his own expectations. He felt like he wasn't in control of his situation. He felt like his fainting and his seizures were some kind of outside force that was controlling his life, which is kind of true. They did control a lot of his life. He couldn't do a lot of things because of them. And for that reason, Wilder longed for dominance and control and power. He wanted to have control of the situation because he never felt that he had that. And before long, this need for dominance and power and control bled into other areas of his life. He started wanting control and power over people. He would have fantasies about fighting people and winning, knocking them out, because he felt like physically as well, he was quite a scrawny kid. He was very skinny. He was quite small for his age. And again, physically, he felt he wasn't meeting the expectations that he had of himself in his head. But all of this was going on the inside. From the outside, nobody knew that Christopher Wilder was really feeling like this. Nobody knew that he was struggling so much inside. On the outside, he was just such a nice, normal boy. He was the same as any other kid in his whole school. And his parents gave him the absolute best childhood that they possibly could. They sent him to private school. They would take him on trips, especially back to America. Whenever they were over in the Philippines or Australia or something like that, they'd take him back to America so that he could see his family. They even got him dual American-Australian citizenship as soon as they could. So they were really trying to care for this kid and give him everything he needed to thrive as a person. But despite the head starts that this man was given in his life, going to private school and stuff like that, he didn't take advantage of it at all. In fact, he wasted it completely. He didn't pay attention in school. Bear in mind, this is a very expensive, very well-respected school that he went to, and he just messed about all day, every day, never did his homework, never studied, and he came out with below average grades. And that was because for most of his teenage years, he just spent it messing about with his friends. He would go to the beach with them almost every night. They would get drunk underage on the beach. He would sneak out in the night to do this, and then he wouldn't get home until like the early hours of the morning, and then he'd have to go to school after like 2 hours sleep. He just was not helping himself at all. In fact, he was making it worse for himself. But Wilder had a lot of friends. He was a very, very popular person. I guess that was his trade-off. He didn't get very good grades, but at least everyone wanted to be his friend. At least everyone knew him. It was in his teenage years when he started playing sports, mainly surfing. He loved surfing. And this hobby, getting into surfing, completely changed this guy's life. He became really physically fit through this. He had this really athletic physique, and this gained him a lot of female attention. It raised his confidence through the roof. It gave him this whole new lease of life. The shy little scrawny kid was gone, and here was this confident, charming, charismatic, physically strong, courageous man that he always wanted to be. Just like his father was. Just like he'd always beaten himself up to become as a child. He was finally that man. But even though he'd achieved the goal of being the man that he always wanted to be, that didn't stop those inside feelings of inferiority for Christopher Wilder. He still had that overwhelming urge to dominate and control and overpower a situation, because those feelings of being out of control of his own life, they never went. Even though he was now in control of it, he still felt like he wasn't. And those feelings, like I said, they'd already started bleeding out into other areas of his life, but now he was starting to view women through that lens, which you can already see how dangerous that is going to become for him and for others and for women. He saw women as something to dominate and own, something to conquer, something to use at his disposal. He found himself not really seeing the appeal of consensual sex, because to him it wasn't a conquest that way. It wasn't something that he'd earned and took power of. So he wasn't interested in having consensual sex. It took all of the fun out of it for him. And it's not even like he could have just had a consensual dom-sub relationship, because it was the consent that put him off. He wanted to be genuinely forceful. He didn't want to pretend. He didn't want to, he didn't want it to be a controlled situation. He wanted to use women. And it was at this point, when he was about 15 or 16 years old, when Christopher Wilder began having thoughts about raping women. Right now, they were just thoughts in his head, but of course they wouldn't stay that way for very long. It was around this time in his life when he started acting up at school. He'd always been a bad student, didn't do his homework and stuff, but now he was genuinely skipping school most days. He didn't even show his face there anymore. Only now, it wasn't to go get drunk on the beach with his friends. It wasn't to hang out with anyone, actually. It was so that he could go out alone and stalk women. So Wilder would go out into town. He would just walk around the town by himself until he noticed a girl that he deemed attractive, and then he would begin stalking her. He would follow her everywhere she went, from shop to shop, and then eventually, when she would walk home, he would follow closely behind her, although he wouldn't approach her. He would let her go inside her house, and he would wait outside. He would hide in a bush or behind a fence under the cover of darkness and watch through her window, hoping to get a glimpse of her getting undressed. He did this a couple of times before he eventually got caught. One particular girl that he tried to do it to, she had opposite neighbours who saw him hiding behind a bush outside her house watching her get changed, so they obviously called the police. Police arrived, they spoke with Wilder, and unbelievably, they just gave him a warning. Just give him a warning and let him on with his day. So obviously, that is just going to confirm in his brain that there's no consequences for these actions. He barely even saw what he was doing as wrong because the one group of people that are supposed to enforce the laws didn't care. Just sent him on his way with a warning. So of course, he carried on doing it. Don't we see this all the time with massive criminals like murderers, serial killers? They will break smaller laws like this and the police won't give them serious consequences. They'll just let them off, or they'll end up getting off of a charge. And that only reinforces in their brain that they can do it and there's never any consequences for their actions. If punishments are too light, or in this case non-existent, then there's no deterrent there. There's nothing putting them off of doing it again, so they will likely reoffend. And let's be honest, most of them do. And that he did. But he only got worse from there. And at this point, he actually started spying on his own mother. He would watch her undress, and he would sometimes even steal her clothes and masturbate into them. Or he would wear them as he masturbated. It's clear that he doesn't see women as humans, especially not family. He just sees them as sexual objects to get whatever kind of gratification you need from them, and then they have no other use other than as a sexual being. He continued spying on other women that weren't his mother, but after a while, the thrill of it was starting to die down, and Wilder felt that he needed something more. And at one point during the day, Christopher Wilder turned to his friends and suggested that they try and pick up some girls. You know, they try and get talking to some girls on the beach and invite them over to drink with them. Which would be innocent enough, I suppose. That is, until you learn that the girl Christopher Wilder chose to go up and flirt with and try and pull, she was 13 years old, and he's 17 right now. Wilder spotted this 13-year-old girl playing in the sand, and he pointed her out to his friends, and he said, "Come on, I found one." So they all approached her. They said hello, they complimented her, they flattered her so much. They were telling her she was pretty, they offered her some alcohol because, you know, they were all very drunk at this point. And this girl was very shy. I mean, obviously, a group of almost adult men have just approached her as she was just trying to play in the sand by herself. She's uncomfortable. She's barely even a teenager, and they're all trying to flirt with her, offer her alcohol. She's completely out of her depth. She's nervous. And at one point, Christopher Wilder even came over to her and dropped down next to her, like sat himself next to her, which only made her even more visibly nervous. She was so uncomfortable, in fact, that she started gathering her things to leave. And she got kind of halfway off the ground when Wilder grabbed her arm and pulled her back down. He wasn't going to let her leave. But now, Wilder was angry that this girl had even tried to get away from him, and we know how he views women at this point. He was going to punish her for this. He dragged this 13-year-old girl by her arm behind quite a large sand dune. This particular beach they were on had these huge sand dunes. He dragged her until they were out of sight of the rest of the beach, and he raped her there. Bear in mind, his friends are right there. You know, they were a few feet away. They watched him drag her behind the sand dune. They could probably hear the whole thing. Some sources even refer to this as a gang rape, which to me obviously suggests that some of his friends even joined in at parts. They could have even joined in for the whole thing. I'm not entirely sure. I don't know the exact details of this incident, and I probably wouldn't say them online anyway, because this ordeal must have been so traumatic for this girl. If none of his friends had anything to do with the actual rape, at the very least, they knew it was going on and they didn't help her. So they were complicit. And when Wilder was done, he simply just stood up, put his clothes back on, walked back out to his friend group who were just waiting for him on the beach, and they carried on with their day as if nothing had just happened. This girl got up, she was in tears, she was trying to put her clothes back on, and she ran over to the closest group of people that she could on the beach, and she told them everything. These people that she ran up to called the police for her, and they arrived that same day. She told them everything. She even knew Christopher Wilder's name because the group had been talking before he raped her. So she gave police his name and he was arrested that same evening. He did have to face a trial for this, as he should, and he was looking at some jail time, obviously. But at this trial, it seemed as though justice would not be served the way that it should have been. Wilder's own parents came to the trial, so they knew that their son was a rapist at this point in time. They came to his defense, telling the judge that their son was a good kid, you know, he's got a bright future ahead of him. He was a good athlete. He went to a very prestigious private school. He was a good guy, you know, this was just a mistake. And unfortunately, we know how these things go. This happens way too often that the judge agrees. He sees this rapist standing in front of him and he chooses to ignore the fact that he is a rapist. And they just look at everything that this man could do, could grow up to do. The judge decided to go easy on Christopher Wilder, seeing him as a promising young man with a bright future ahead of him that shouldn't be ruined over a mistake that he made in his teenage years. It's absolutely horrific that this thing, it even still happens now in 2021. We read about it on Twitter every 6 months. There's a new case where some judge has let a rapist go because they have a promising career, a promising future ahead of them. Instead of giving Christopher Wilder jail time for raping a child, he was instead given a year of probation and some counselling sessions to rehabilitate him so that this wouldn't happen again. It makes me so angry to think that that is the only punishment that this guy had. It's not a punishment. It's not a punishment at all. He raped a child and he didn't so much as get a day in prison for it. Once again, there is no consequences for his actions, and it's only reassured in his brain that nothing's ever going to happen to him. He can just keep doing whatever he wants to do. He's never going to have consequences. So Christopher Wilder did all of his therapy sessions that he was ordered to do by the court. However, his therapist really saw the danger in Wilder. His thought process, the things that he was saying in these therapy sessions, you know, his therapist really worried about his future and the future of society on a whole if this guy is out there. His need for dominance and his urge to overpower mainly women was so scary. It was clear that he was in this frame of mind and there was nothing that was going to budge him. He believed that he had the right to use women like that. This therapist actually reported back to their higher ups and they said, nah, this guy needs something way more than therapy. He needs to be on some kind of like medication, on a register. He needs regular checkups. We need to be keeping an eye on this guy. Otherwise, this will fester into something bigger, something way more dangerous than it even is right now. So they finished his therapy sessions, and instead, Christopher Wilder was referred on for electroshock therapy, which he hated. To be fair, I think anyone would. Electroshock therapy sounds like the most inhumane thing in the world, but it wasn't the actual act of being shocked that Christopher Wilder didn't like. It was the lack of control over the situation. It was the lack of power, the lack of dominance. He was strapped down to a bed and had electric shocks sent through his body, and he could do nothing about it. He couldn't move. He didn't like feeling submissive like that. And it's actually been theorised that this electroshock therapy only took his sexual deviancy to new levels. It sparked new ideas in his brain. He wanted to do to women what was being done to him. He wanted to lay a woman down, strap her in, and put her through intense pain and torture. So if anything, this therapy only made him worse, which was unexpected. So by now, in the case, Christopher Wilder is about 21 years old, and he goes to the beach almost every single day. He loves surfing. He's never away from the beach. And one day when he was there, he met this 20-year-old school teacher. I couldn't find her name anywhere, but he met this 21-year-old school teacher and her 15-year-old younger sister. He approached the two of them, he struck up a conversation and charmed them so much that he actually convinced this teacher and her younger sister to come back to the beach the next day. He said that he could give them the time of their lives. He knew that beach like the back of his hand. He knew where all the best surfing spots were, all the best places to eat, all the best places to swim. And these girls were like, yeah, okay, let's come back tomorrow. And they did. And they had the best day ever the next day. They drank together, they swam together, they surfed together, they had the best time. And then at the end of the day, Christopher Wilder turned to that 20-year-old teacher and asked her if she wanted to be more than friends. And this woman, even though she'd only known Christopher Wilder for 2 days, she was completely swept off her feet by this man. He was so charming, so charismatic. She said she didn't really know what came over her because she wasn't the type of girl to just get swept up by a man, but she said yes. She said yes, she wanted to be with Christopher Wilder. And so they were. And for the next few weeks, things were going really, really well. They were seeing each other often. That was until one day, this woman noticed that Christopher Wilder behaved rather oddly around her 15-year-old sister. It was clear that there was some sort of attraction. He was flirting with this 15-year-old girl who was about 6 years younger than him. A child as well. Bear in mind, he's 21 now. So I think at first his girlfriend just tried to convince herself that it wasn't happening. She didn't want to believe that her boyfriend was attracted to her younger sister, that he was a paedophile, and so she just tried to block it out of her brain as much as she could. But it was actually the girl's father who noticed that this was going on, and he confronted Christopher Wilder about it. And Wilder assured his girlfriend's father that he only had eyes for his girlfriend and that he was just really close friends with her younger sister. You know, he felt like she was his own younger sister. He assured him that there was nothing to worry about. And the father believed him. But it only got worse from there, because after that, Christopher Wilder turned his attentions from the 15-year-old girl to his girlfriend's mother. When they were alone, he would flirt with her mother, he would try to peep on her as she was getting changed, and the whole family disapproved of Christopher Wilder, obviously apart from his girlfriend. But his girlfriend didn't want to hear it. She didn't want to hear it from her family because she really liked Christopher Wilder. She didn't listen to her family, and within just a few months of dating Christopher Wilder, the two of them got married. So she was now his wife. But this marriage would last less than a month because as soon as the two of them moved in together, Christopher Wilder changed completely. He was suddenly into violent sex, very outlandish fetishes that she never in her wildest dreams would even try. He would ask her for sex multiple times a day, and she just thought, what the hell has happened to this man that I really liked a few months ago? It was just too much for her. It was way too much. And so she started refusing sex. She didn't want it multiple times a day anymore. But the refusal only made things worse because Christopher Wilder started beating her whenever she refused, beating her until she just gave in. But that wasn't everything that Christopher Wilder did wrong in this relationship. He was abusive on so many different levels, and I couldn't even find the full details of this relationship in my research, but I know it was way worse than what I can even find. I even found that Christopher Wilder would actually try to kill his wife although he would try and do it in a way that it wouldn't make it look like it was a murder. So he would drain all the brake fluid from her car in the hopes that maybe she would need to brake and then the brakes wouldn't work properly, she would have a car crash and maybe die that way. He once turned all the gas on in the house and then just walked outside, and he was standing just outside by his car watching the house as she slept inside, probably just waiting for her to die. Honestly, it sounds so terrifying, it sounds so scary, and luckily this woman managed to escape the marriage the first chance she got, and she survived. She survived her abusive husband. But not before finding a briefcase of Christopher Wilder's, and it was full of his photography. As I'm sure you've already picked up from the first half of this video, Christopher Wilder would often approach women, strangers, like women he didn't know on the street, and tell them that he was a fashion photographer. He wasn't. He had no qualifications, he'd never done any jobs like that. He just had a camera. He would walk up to them, tell them he was a photographer, and ask if they wanted to take some pictures with him. And more often than not, it would work. And he would make these women strip down, sometimes into their underwear, sometimes completely naked for these shoots, for this man that they'd only just met. And little did they know that this wasn't a professional photo shoot that they were doing, even though it didn't even seem it. And those pictures weren't going in a portfolio. They weren't going to make these girls famous. They were just going to go in some sick pervert's drawer so that he could use them whenever he wanted. One thing I actually forgot to mention that happened throughout his marriage to this woman was that one day they got a knock on the door, and so both of them at the same time went to go and answer it, and when they opened the door, it was the police. They stood there and told Christopher Wilder that they suspected him of blackmailing a teenage girl for sex. And even though his wife was standing right there next to him, he looked the police in the eye and admitted everything. He admitted that he'd done that. He even started going into detail, reliving the events to the police about how they'd had sex in his bed. He turned to his wife, told her that he had had sex with this teenage girl in their bed. I say had sex with, he raped this teenage girl in their bed. But sadly, this teenage girl didn't actually want to press charges against Christopher Wilder. It's understandable. This kind of thing would be so traumatic that you wouldn't want to relive it. And so, sadly, he never had any consequences for that as well. But the last straw for his wife, believe it or not, that wasn't the last straw, that he raped a child in their bed. Anyway, the last straw for his wife was when Christopher Wilder actually asked her younger sister, her 15-year-old sister, to do a photo shoot with him. And of course, his wife knew exactly what that meant. She'd found his briefcase. She'd found all his photos. She knew that he was asking her younger sister to get naked on camera for him. And in that moment, everything blew up in Christopher Wilder's face. His wife left him. She left the house. She went back and moved in with her parents and told them everything about everything Christopher Wilder had ever done to her throughout their marriage. And she also made another quite bold accusation, very bold accusation actually, and that was that she suspected that her husband, Christopher Wilder, was a murderer, that he had murder victims. They just didn't know them. She actually suspected that Wilder was responsible for a very specific unsolved double murder case from that area in Australia. It's a very infamous case over there named the Wanda Beach murders, and at this point it had remained unsolved for 4 years. And everything about Christopher Wilder screamed that he was capable of murder, of a double murder as well. And there were a lot of circumstantial links between Wilder and this unsolved murder case. But we'll talk more about that in part 2. Thank you so much for watching part 1. It means the world to me because this case has been my life for the last month. I'll be back with part 2 in like 2 days. I promise you. I promise I won't leave you as long as last time. I read your comments. I know you didn't like being left that long. It was out of my control, I'm sorry. Make sure you subscribe to my channel with notifications on so that you don't miss part 2 and part 3. Thanks again to Function of Beauty for sponsoring this video. I really appreciate it. They are one of my favourite brands. So if you want to get 20% off of your first set, you can click the link to do so down below in the description. Trust me, it will be the best thing you ever do for your hair. I promise. I promise. A huge, huge thank you to all of my channel members for supporting me and helping decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can click the link to do so in the description, or you can click the join button if you're on a desktop. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I really, really appreciate it. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up down below or leave a comment down below letting me know what you thought of this case so far. If you want to subscribe, there'll be a link to do so right here. I post true crime content like this all the time, and you want to be subscribed if you want to watch part 2 and part 3. You can click this link right here to subscribe to my second channel if you want. I'm uploading loads of vlogs over there at the moment. There's some fun stuff going on and I'm really excited about what's going to happen over there. Or if you want to watch another true crime video in the meantime, there'll be a playlist on screen right now. Bye!